Hello and welcome to School of Prayer. This is the last of our Lent sessions on prayer, although, as has already been mentioned to you, there is an option to continue at some point shortly after Easter if you would like to. Do speak to Mike or myself if you would be keen to carry on. Our session today is on the Examen. The Examen is an ancient form of prayer made into its current form by St. Ignatius of Loyola and the Jesuit movement that he founded, but it has its roots in much older practice. At its most simple, the Examen is a way of reviewing your day prayerfully with God, of looking back, seeing where God was active, looking for moments of blessing, exploring those areas for which we are sorry, and for asking God's grace for the day to come. Typically, the Examen is a prayer of the evening, a prayer when we look back on the day, maybe the last thing we do before we go to bed. Here's a warning though. Don't do it in bed. People who try to do their Examen in bed quite often find that they fall asleep long before they've finished. If you're not a night person, if you're the person whose brain isn't fit for anything after about 9 o'clock in the evening and doing it last thing just doesn't work for you, that really doesn't matter. The Examen can be done at any part of the day. Just review the last 24 hours. If it works for you best in the morning, do it in the morning. If it works for you best at lunchtime, do it then. All that matters is that you look back prayerfully on the events of your last 24 hours alongside God. Today's session is going to be quite nuts and bolts, if you like. I'm going to talk you through the practice of doing an Examen. This relies a lot less on feelings and emotions and much more on doing it. But we'll come back to that in a minute. The big idea behind the Examen is that it is so much easier to see God in hindsight than it is necessarily to recognise his actions in the moment. Perhaps some of you are familiar with the poem about the footsteps on the beach. Somebody walks along the beach, and when they look back, they see sets of footprints representing themselves and God. Sometimes they see two sets, sometimes they see one. They can see where God has been active in their life. The punchline, of course, to this particular poem is that at difficult points in their life, they only see one set of footprints, and that makes them angry and upset. Where was God in those difficult moments? And the voice of God speaks and says, "My beloved child, in those moments, I was carrying you." However you feel about this particular poem, and some might say it's been done to death, it does show us a way of seeing God's action in our lives by looking back. A famous biblical example of this can be found in Exodus, in chapter 33. Let me read to you. Chapter 33 and verse 17. The Lord said to Moses, "I will do the very thing that you have asked, for you have found favour in my sight, and I know you by name." Moses said, "Show me your glory, I pray." And he said, "I will make all my goodness pass before you, and I will proclaim before you the name, the Lord. And I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and will show mercy on whom I will show mercy. But," he said, "you cannot see my face, for no one shall see me and live." And the Lord continued, "See, there is a place by me where you shall stand on the rock. And while my glory passes by, I will put you in a cleft of the rock, and I will cover you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will take away my hand, and you shall see my back, but my face shall not be seen." Even Moses did not see God face to face in the moment, but he saw his back as he passed by. This theology underpins the practice of the Examen. Seeing God's back as he has passed by in our day. As we grow more familiar with recognizing where God has been in our lives, we become, as it happens, more practiced at seeing him in the moment too. When we begin to recognize how God has interacted with us through the course of our day, we experience him showing up more and more in the present. As we review our day with him and ask for grace for what is to come, we become more practiced in seeing our lives as he does and acting as he would have us act. It's not an understatement to say that this practice of prayer has been revolutionary for me in my spiritual life and for many others. It is a prayer staple which I commend to you. So let's travel together as we explore the practice of the Examen. The Examen comes in 5 steps. Their titles are these: presence, gratitude, review, confession, and grace. First of all, we come into God's presence. I don't need to tell you that it's terribly bad theology to invite God into your prayers. But it is nonetheless something which many of us do on a regular basis. Not because we don't believe that God's there already, but because we need that intentional moment. It's a way of setting aside time for God, a way of drawing into his presence as we invite him into ours. There are all sorts of ways you can do this. Simply some formal prayers to mark out this time for God. Maybe just to sit in quiet. Maybe you'd like to do something more practical. Maybe you would like to look at the chair in which you're about to sit. Then you can imagine God looking at you as you pray. Maybe you're an artist. You can draw yourself and use that picture that you have created. Maybe you could take a selfie. Perhaps just sit simply and invite God in. Let me be really clear at this point, though. It doesn't matter if you don't feel God's presence. God is present with you, and feelings are a really poor indicator of almost everything in prayer. Well, not everything, but they can mislead us. You do not need to feel God's presence for him to be present with you. You do not need to experience God for him to be present in your life. If you wait for the feelings, you may never start to pray. Feelings come and feelings go. So far as prayer is concerned, It is enough to do it. So don't worry if you don't feel God's presence. Simply mark out the time to be present with God and leave the rest to Him. The next stage of the Examen is gratitude. We begin with gratitude because otherwise the negative stuff can overshadow us. Because a day can feel consumed by bad feelings, by anger, by frustration. But each day is gift. So we turn to God in gratitude for what has been good in our day. Even if it's only a tiny moment, even if it's something which we hadn't even really thought about until now, we give thanks to God for those things with which we have been blessed in our day. The third section of the Examen is review, and this is usually the biggest part of the prayer. What's most important when you come to your review is that you remember that this is prayer. This isn't remembering, this isn't just mulling over the events of the day. This is explicitly sharing them with God. So address these thoughts to God. Dear God, this morning didn't start as I'd planned. I really had intended to get up early. I was going to get on. I was going to sort out some work and some housework. But somehow it didn't quite work out like that. Lord, why is it that I'm no good in the mornings? Anyway, do you get the idea? Talk to God. Why not make use of that bench that Mike talked about last week? But rather than sitting in companionable, contemplative silence with God, fill Him in on how your day has been. Talk to Him. Prayer isn't we remember or yeah, that didn't go so well. Oh dear, really, I must. Oh, and at 12 o'clock, it's really talking to God. Do it out loud if it helps. Tell God as if God were sitting next to you, listening to every word. Talk. Invite God to show you His view of your day. As things occur, these might be your memories, or these might be God praying in you, turning your attention to those moments when God was most present, turning your attention to those things that God needs you to address. Spend as long as you need telling God about your day, looking for opportunities to see love, to see blessing. As you practice the Examen more and more, you will start to notice patterns emerging. Things that you're not that impressed with, which seem to happen all the time. This is God showing you an area of your life that needs some attention. As you practice the Examen more and more, you will see those places where God typically shows up. You will see those relationships in which you experience God's love. You will experience those relationships where, frankly, you might need to try a little harder. Spend time with God, talking about your day, and let Him pray in you, which He is doing, even if you cannot feel it. remember my words of warning. Feeling prayerful, feeling God's presence is not always a good indicator of prayer. God speaks to us in so many different ways. Through our senses, as we've heard from Jan in our session about Franciscan prayer. But through our intellect, through our memory, through our subconscious, and through our conscience. Which leads us to the next step of the examen, which is confession. As we have reviewed our day, we will already have taken note of those places where we've fallen short. Let's confess them to God. Not because we want to conclude our examen with shame, but because we need to see where we have been wrong. Because if we are honest with God about all aspects of our life, because if we say sorry, and if we repent, and if we allow ourselves to receive his forgiveness, then we are far more able to receive love and to show love. Don't let these things hang over until the next time. Be honest with God about everything in your day, especially perhaps the things you don't want to share. The final step of the examen is grace. In light of all that we have reviewed and prayed and thought about and confessed and given thanks for, let's look forward. Pray for God's grace to tackle what is to come, for the grace to see him more present in our lives, to tackle those areas that we have confessed, to see him in those we meet, to deal with the things that are worrying us in the future, to feel his call on our lives. And that's it. That's the examen. I reckon that perhaps 10 or 15 minutes a day would do quite nicely for an examen. But even if you've only got a minute or two, maybe you need to build up to 10, or maybe you're thinking 10, that's not enough. I need an hour to do that. What matters is that you start. The first step is always the hardest. Step intentionally into God's presence. And like Moses, look to see where he has passed you by in the day that is behind you. Because in doing so, you will become more and more aware of his presence in the present.